welcome. I'm Allison Tom, alumna of the University of California, Santa Cruz, and a professional television journalist. Our conversation today focuses on the topic of science, technology, and education. Joining me at the Student Conference Center at the UC Santa Cruz campus are two very distinguished experts on the topic. Our first guest is Chancellor M.R.C. Greenwood, who oversees UC Santa Cruz, a research university combined with an uncommon commitment to undergraduate education. She's served as the Chancellor since 1996. Dr. Greenwood is a distinguished national leader in science and higher education policy. Among her many contributions, she has served as Associate Director for Science and Technology in the U.S. White House. She's also the former president for the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Dr. Greenwood is a professor of biology at UC Santa Cruz, and she's a well-known policy leader in the science community. Our other special guest today is Dr. Kathy Sullivan. She's the president and CEO of the Center of Science and Industry, also known as COSI. Under her leadership, COSI has deepened its commitment to expanding science and learning opportunities throughout the state of Ohio and beyond. Dr. Sullivan is also a former astronaut, joining NASA in 1978 as a member of the first shuttle class. Among many accomplishments, she's recognized as the first American woman to walk in space. Welcome to both of you.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Let's start our conversation with the topic of science and education and where it stands today.
It's in a rather sorry state in this country, I'm afraid to say. COSI began 60 years ago over just this kind of concern and the need to complement the schooling that happens in science and math with a broader opportunity to educate ourselves throughout our lifetime. But today we see from a number of research studies continuing low rankings of United States grade school children as against international counterparts ranging from England to Germany and Japan, and continued controversy about the nature and manner of curriculum design and the adequacy or superabundance of homework, among other things.
I think there are many of us that would say that science and math education today in the United States is in a crisis. And it's in a crisis for a number of reasons. I mean, one, of course, are these international testing scores that everyone's very concerned about. But the other is that we are now a nation that depends increasingly on scientific literacy among our adults, and we depend on basic understanding of science just to get through today's everyday jobs. And we need for our young people to be interested in creating new ideas and moving technologies and ideas forward in order to create new industries and new opportunities for the future. So the sheer foundation of what this nation rests on and much of its economy right now depends on the nation's ability to sustain, nourish, and grow science and math education. And one other point I would make is that 40 years ago, 50 years ago, it might have been enough for the nation to train a few good scientists or a class of people that would be doing a lot of the scientific innovation. But now it's a cornerstone of our society, and it's absolutely critical that everybody knows some science and that some people know the best that there is to know in the world.
I think that's a very crucial point. The debate should not be focused on the adequacy of supply of master's and PhD level engineers, or certainly not that alone. It really is, we're at a moment in time, certainly, I think, and in our future, citizenship, effectiveness as a working, living citizen in this society of ours really does require a better level of science literacy than we are giving to most of our students and most of our children.
And it's going to be hard to do, because one of the things we know from the data collected by the National Science Foundation is that in some districts, up to 80% of the people who are teaching our young folks have never had a college science course in their preparation to teach, because of course it's not a major emphasis in K through 12 and K through 6 educational preparedness. So we've got a problem that the very people who capture the imaginations of our young people are the least qualified to deliver this enthusiasm in the fields where we need it most, science and math.
And most true in the youngest grades, where the starting foundation of solid comprehension of core concepts and the building of the basic toolkit or skill set, if you will, that can propel a student into these topics in junior high or high school in a more creative way. That foundation is so at risk of being set very weakly, very scattered, because about at least 40% of the deficiency in grade school science performance is reckoned to come from lack of sufficient content knowledge on the part of the very people who are teaching in those classrooms.
But why do you suppose that's the case? I mean, is it because there's simply too many other topics that seem to be more of a precedence? Is it because there's not enough education? What's the reason
Well,
for
part of it is some state regulations. I mean, here in California, the amount of time that is designated for science to be taught in primary school is under 10 minutes a day in some cases. So, I mean, I can hardly tell my grandson how an owl hoots in 10 minutes, let alone how the world of birds works or how anything really relates to the natural world, which are the things, of course, that young children are most interested in, is, you know, things like marine mammals or snakes or rats or bunnies. Or
curriculum design is also a piece of the problem, however. You could take marine mammals and use them as a lens through which to look at every imaginable dimension of the sciences, from oceanography to chemistry, at a good conceptual level for any grade level. But the way most states choose to design curricula, and in fact most districts, because that's where the design is a very fractured mosaic. And in Ohio, having just participated on the advisory level in designing new Ohio statewide standards, it becomes almost more like a deck of Trivial Pursuit cards. We can't just pick marine mammals because, gosh, that leaves out my chemistry or your earth sciences or your preferred subject. And so even at young grades, what you find students getting all too often are little snippets and bits, almost anecdotal things that fit into the 10-minute slot, that don't overly tax a teacher that may not have had much science themselves and may not feel very comfortable getting too deep into it, and that just become a kaleidoscope of disconnected facts. What you see happening over and over again is an ability, as far away as the test date, to repeat those facts, but not really a comprehension of any of the unifying concepts or principles underneath them. So when the student goes and encounters a new topic in the next class or something new in their own world, it's not really their learning that they recognize and take with them and can begin to build on from that point.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe one way to address this too is to teach younger generations in two ways, one in formal and informal environments. Let's talk about one, defining what those two are, the differences between formal and informal learning environments, and also what are some of the key issues that need to be addressed for younger generations and for the general public at large with what science and education is about.
My simple-minded way of explaining to people in shorthand the informal to formal distinction is basically this. It's clear what happens during a school day in a schoolhouse. We tend to call that education, but it is in fact schooling. Education goes on in countless other venues and moments throughout all of our life, and the informal learning settings that we all know and are familiar with range from zoos and aquaria to hands-on science centers like COSI in Ohio, a genre of which there are several hundred in communities of all sizes across this country and a growing number internationally. Participation in the Science Center field alone is measured in hundreds of millions of people a year. In Columbus, at COSI alone, we touch and teach 1.2 million people a year throughout the entire state. And in fact, last year, just having looked at our data, every zip code in our local area, every county in Ohio, and every state in the country is represented amongst our visitors. So there's a hunger for interactive, engaging learning to complement and extend the schooling that we have during the school day.
And I think that one of the things that's happening nationally right now that relates to this distinction between informal and formal has to do with the comment we made earlier, which is that in the classroom of today's primary school, the amount of time that can be or is dedicated to science is very short. If you go to these informal settings, the amount of time that a family or an individual student could spend at an exhibit is really dependent upon the amount of time they have, their setting, their patience, their age, whatever you want. These informal organizations are often populated and staffed by folks who do have a deep understanding of science. They've got very excellent training. They then have educational backgrounds which allow them to comprehend what can an 8-year-old really understand about this, what can a 12-year-old understand, what can a 3-year-old understand. And so our challenge, and one that Kathy and I have both been involved in through a project which is called the Center for Informal Learning with Schools, is to try to connect these wonderful resources of the informal facilities like COSI, like the Exploratorium that happens to be one of our partners, Children's Discovery Museum, our own, very own Seymour Marine Discovery Center, which we deliberately have designed to help students and their families not just understand science, but understand how scientists think about science, with an idea, of course, trying to inspire some young people to say, gee, I'd like to be a scientist instead of a businessman or something else that I'm sure would be equally good, but we would like them to see them be scientists. This connection between these two organizations, the informal organizations and the schools, may be the critical path to our future, because it is the folks in the informal institutions that are able to do the experiments to develop follow-on curriculum for those 10-minute segments that you get in your schools. So if I have 2 young grandchildren right now, so if my grandson gets exposed to 10 minutes in the school on an average basis, at least my son and daughter-in-law have the option of taking them on the weekend to a facility where they could spend 2 hours learning about something.
And we've done some fascinating work just over the last 2 years at COSI on this nexus between the formal and the informal, using some of the research and findings that are being furthered in our collaboration at the Sills Institute. We designed a program centered on inquiry learning as a style of learning, and we brought in teachers from 13 districts throughout the state of Ohio, scattered around, urban, suburban, rural, all of them in fairly dire academic straits, classified on their achievement as either academic watch, academic emergency, or continuous improvement. 200 teachers from all those districts. We provided 100 hours of professional development, equally divided between further content knowledge in one of 4 different science topical strands and inquiry learning methodologies. We then followed them with professional development back to their classrooms, so they were married back with their students but supported to bring those techniques into the classroom. We brought them and their classes to the Science Center, using it as a laboratory platform, if you will, for further encouraging that. And then to get around some of the other social factors that often can impede science achievement and a sense of purpose to it, we had a community night so that both school administrators and the parent community could join in and become partners in this kind of learning. The scores are back from most of those participating districts now on the most recent round of 4th grade proficiency exams, and we are seeing typically 20 to 40 percentage point improvements over the prior year in the 4th grade science proficiencies. It's spectacular. It does make a real on-the-ground difference in the lives and the educational futures of these young folks.
Is there also any distinction between the difference in how genders are being taught science and education?
Very, very much. We see that on the floor of the Science Center, in school programs, and I focus on 2 things. One is young girls in particular, as they reach the age to begin to become socially aware and begin to pick up cues that I remember from growing up, and I know Marcy does, of you've just passed a threshold in life from when it was okay and kind of socially fun to be smart, where it's really not a good thing to be too smart. And probably the strongest and most confident young girls at that juncture maybe just become a little more quiet about it, but don't inwardly give up. Other girls do give up. And the second one is both teachers and parents around them. And we have countless reports and anecdotes we see in the classroom of a young girl at 11 or 12 beginning to hit science or hit math, the deeper points of it, a bad grade, and taking it home to mom or dad. And instead of getting an injunction and an exhortation to step up to the plate and do well, or an encouragement that she can, so often hears, well, that's all right, dear, mommy wasn't any good at math either. And the clear implication is you can be fine in life not knowing this stuff. Don't try. Don't worry about it.
And yet the research data show that students that do not succeed, at least at the level of high school algebra, have almost no future and have very limited job options in terms of advanced job training and careers. It is extremely difficult to advance if you don't have some of these skills.
So you have the middle school and high school years when girls enter that period ahead academically of boys, and the social pressures largely cause them to step aside or opt out. The boys accelerate and the girls build themselves a 3 to 5 year backlog at precisely the schooling point that it's almost impossible to overcome.
But even so, one can make an argument, this wasn't the exact question you asked, Allison, but you can also make the argument that young boys are also dropping out of science. that, that they get to a certain stage where it gets more and more challenging, and there are also social factors that seem to discourage them from continuing the high level of discipline and the focus that they might need. I think one of the problems that we have with young girls dates way back to when they start going to museums even. We, at Santa Cruz, we have a research project with the Children's Discovery Museum that several of our faculty members are involved in which they have actually studied the behavior of adults towards the children that they bring to the Children's Discovery Museum based on gender. So they look at how mothers talk to boys and girls, and how fathers talk to boys and girls, how other relatives talk to boys and girls. And what they have discovered is that both mothers and fathers spend much more time explaining in some detail the exhibit or the problem or the hands-on experiment to young boys than they do to young girls. So it's something that once you begin to understand that, then you can design the exhibits a little differently, and that's one of the things that our institution's been contributing to as part of this working between the informal institutions and the formal institutions, trying to help the museum designers also get it right with respect to how to encourage an interaction that's likely to have the outcome that young girls get as much as young boys do out of such visits.
And to encourage them to want to be interested in that.
Well, and to help the parents recognize their own behavioral characteristics and interpret and facilitate more effectively.
Their social behaviors.
Parents are shocked when they hear this, because they're convinced
that they're being very even-handed.
That they're very even-handed, that they've really done exactly the same thing, and they really don't. And so this is important research to do, because it helps both the teachers and the schools understand, as well as parents and the museums, because what we've had in the past has been a real disconnect between the informal institutions and the schools, and that the informal institutions are sort of, gee whiz, wow, isn't this great? They sometimes have not in the past been related to the curricular content that is expected by the schools for the teachers. And so the teachers have had much more difficulty utilizing them, because the curriculum plan says this is the time when we do X, and they go to the museum. They need help in the museum to have those kind of curricular experiences. And we're getting, I think, somewhat better at working to align those.
Certainly at COSI, every exhibit from design phase and every educational program and vehicle that we have is explicitly referenced by grade level to both Ohio and national standards for just that reason. If you can take the logistical issues out of the teachers' hands and really make them confident about it, from curriculum mapping down to coat room and lunch, then the visit is more effective. They really are engaged as that facilitator and educator.
And then the teacher can do what the teacher does best, which is pay attention to the student and help the student learn at their own rate and get the most out of it.
Without going too far ahead, there's one other critical concern that seems to be emerging right now in today's society about whether or not the basics, the science of 101, is really truly being taught to the general public as parents, to help educate our younger generations as well. Is that true, and are we losing sight of what the basics of science are for these generations?
I'm very concerned about it. I'm not a formal student of the research literature on this, but from my own experience with the Ohio Science Curriculum Advisory Panel, we really are at risk, and I think it's commonplace in many statewide curricula. We're not even a quarter-inch deep and 100 miles wide. And if you look comparatively at some other nations where you see the curriculum scaffolding more effectively around a core set of principles and concepts that you explore in greater depth, with greater meaning, with greater import at subsequent grade levels. And you see much more repetition of about the same level of it in many American curricula, and you see that sort of scattered problem of trying to really understand when are you encountering the same phenomena, when are you encountering the same principle of simple machines in a different setting. So it looks different, but it is the same principle. And how do you get enough real comprehension of some of those fundamental principles and basics to recognize that and discover the power of that comprehension and the power it gives you as an independent learner and independent agent? Teaching kids a kaleidoscope of randomly connected facts is not the way to generate that kind of deep comprehension.
Yeah, I agree with Kathy. I would say two things. One is the basics aren't what you might remember or I might remember, because science is constantly evolving. Basic concepts in mathematics, basic concepts in science may be enduring over generations, but the science of biology that was taught when I was a child and what we're teaching today have changed radically, and so the content has changed as well. The problem of our curriculum is partly driven by something we haven't discussed, and that is that school districts have to buy textbooks. Textbooks want a market. Textbooks, therefore, try to satisfy a wide variety of markets across school districts and across states. And so one of the things that happens is that they dilute everything in order to cover everything so that every school board can find the piece they need that goes with this part of their curriculum. And this is a self-perpetuating and self-fulfilling prophecy that the books get thicker and the information gets thinner.
Right.
And that's something that the American Association for the Advancement of Science has done a study on, the National Academy has done a study on, and it is an issue for our school boards, our parents, and others to think about. We probably should teach less and teach it better in the younger grades and build on that as we go forward. It's not necessary that everything be taught initially, although there is very infrequently very good consensus on what those individual things that could be and should be taught are. So, the scientists have a share of the blame here too.
Sure, and that's something that obviously everyone can achieve to work on, but it's the recognition of the issue and the problem up front. Good. The other thing too is, maybe just in brief you can touch about it, because I'm sure there's many different ways we can go, but what are some ways, especially with technology that we have today, that might be some innovative and fun interactive uses or ways to get people more involved in learning about science?
I do think that there are some fabulously innovative programs that are being developed by educational software makers that are really very helpful at helping students understand and experiment with various scientific concepts. There's some wonderful ones on the human body that have been developed. There are excellent math curricula, which is a very good thing for students to have to play with, things that teach students sort of math concepts in the form of gameplay, and then as they get drawn in, they teach them a little bit more, and students can learn at their own rate, and if the parents want, they can get feedback at what the students are mastering and then what they're having trouble with, and therefore you could be a better coach as a parent or as a teacher. So there's a lot going on there. We have lots of virtual tours of all kinds of exciting places. The museums, most of the museums have virtual tours, so if you just want to be at home and think you're at COSI, trust me, it's not quite as nice as being at COSI, but it could be a good opportunity for an interaction with a parent and a student, especially at odd times.
We deliver some of the inquiry learning for schools professional development that way. Yes, not only field trips into COSI, but very powerfully, especially middle school and up. The technology lets us be one of the brokers that can take students places they couldn't get to. And to be specific, we take them into cardiac ORs during open chest procedures with full visual and two-way interactive communications with the surgical team, which helps them see not only the amazing coolness of complex surgical procedures, but from a career and workforce point of view, helps them see how many people, how many different specialties, how many different skill sets go into a successful surgery. A watchword about the technology, though, that I think it's wise to keep in mind as designers and users, at a couple of points. One is, if you're not careful about the learning model that you're promulgating through the technology, all that cameras and video ports do is let you have the same old pedantic and boring didactic and ineffective learning style disseminated to multiple places at once, or as I'm fond of saying, we can be deadly dull, boring, and ineffective to many more people simultaneously. That's not a good thing. So you do have to look at the learning model, the teaching model, not just at the ability to connect points. And to the experiential point, there's some anecdotal information around from places like MIT and Stanford and Rensselaer Polytechnic that reminds you of the importance of, again, sort of very rounded experience. they're beginning to see, coming into engineering schools, a large number of kids whose experience with stuff, with gears, with pulleys, is mainly on the great CD-ROMs. And man, it is rendered in 3 dimensions, and you can have a God's eye view of it any which way you want with a click of a mouse. And if you want to see a complex machine pull apart into all its pieces and go back, it's 2 clicks of your mouse. It's stuff that's incredible to get to do. But when they get those kids to engineering school, to start really mastering comprehension of structures and mechanisms and the ability to express them in mathematics and in drawings, they're actually having to create remedial courses that are, you know, remedial play, my label, not theirs, but it is erector sets, and it is taking apart electronic devices to gain that tactile, full comprehension of how the actual things
Which
work.
may be a good thing for women.
Could be.
Because, you know, having the playing field leveled a little bit,
Yes.
so that both men and women have to learn those things as they enter, as
That's
opposed to
right.
before they got there, is a bad thing from the point of view of the engineering professors. It might, however, have an interesting effect later. One thing I was going to say also is that one of the things that technology has done to help students is the actual ability to participate in ongoing things.
Yes.
One of the most popular websites out here in the Monterey Bay area is a website that's operated by the Monterey Bay Aquarium, which works with the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute and is constantly showing what's going on in the Monterey Bay.
It's a great site.
You know, people.
It's like
people
being there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's like being
Yeah.
there, and so you get to be an underground in one of the underwater vehicles, which Kathy's actually spent some time in. I've never quite had the guts to go down in one of the deep sea diving.
That's right. The Mbari ones are all remote control anyway,
Yeah,
so you
right.
don't have to worry
So you don't
about
have to
getting
worry
wet or
about
crowded.
Exactly. A lot of students and teachers follow this. And when I was down in Antarctica,
and animal
they had-
migrations.
Yes, animal
Yeah.
migrations.
Great things to follow on the
getting
web and
students
participate
involved
in.
the biodiversity counts themselves, so they actually have something they're doing where they see their own data getting part of a national data set. These things can all be very,
they're very fun.
exciting and fun for people to use both in the schools and outside of the schools.
And it's an engaging way for them to learn all at their own speed too, which is almost an enhancement.
And to overcome the 10-minute science limit, it's a fusion of many topics that tends to expand the topic time in which science is part of what's happening.
And it helps people go places they would never get a chance to go.
Yes.
I mean, we are constantly surprised at the Seymour Marine Discovery Center with the fact that we have all of these young people who live in, in our southern counties here, and they work near Watsonville and Salinas and places like that. They're only, 45 minutes from the ocean, and they've never been to the ocean, and they've never seen the things that are in the ocean. So, dragging them there first by the technology, and then encouraging them to come to the center where they actually see real people and
Real critters.
real critters and real people.
Yeah.
It can be very exciting.
Let's now address some of the challenges within the science community. For one, are we addressing with the role of women, and are they getting getting respect and somewhat the profession that they need to be, and also are they getting the support that it deserves, or is it a difficult social transformation?
Mixed picture, and very dependent on what discipline you look at. In certainly the fields that I'm familiar with, I would say it's probably 100% better than when I began, but probably still only 50 or 60% as good as it maybe ought to be in some respects. When I was here at UC Santa Cruz as an undergraduate, it was an extraordinary thing in my senior year to be under faculty auspices out to sea with the U.S. Geological Survey. Every other woman, I think there were 2 other women aboard ship who were rather junior level technicians with the USGS, and I felt pretty clear I wanted to go become a research scientist. But you just needed to understand that role models who are doing things that you find exciting or imaginative and admire do not have to look like you. I mean, you could not indulge the find someone who looks like me and then I'll see an instructive model. When I went on to graduate school, again, it was still very controversial, mainly technology or technologist roles and technical support roles. And as usual, and I found this again in the space program, there could only be a certain number of women on any ship because there was only a certain number of bathrooms that the guys thought the women should use. Now, some of these ships were 300 feet long and working in the Arctic, and if you think you're putting on parkas and going 300 feet on the weather decks to find a bathroom, you're wrong, because there's one right there, and it actually works fine. So, that I look back 30-some years ago at those sorts of factors and see now, women leading expeditions hither and yon to the ice in the Antarctic, up to the poles, commanding space shuttles, and that's a tremendous improvement. And yet, I can also still look in those fields and see places where there are enough women you would expect to see greater representation in leadership roles and greater equity in research opportunities and pay opportunities that still seem to be rather lagging.
But it's a much better picture for women who are looking for exciting and fun and interesting careers. I agree with Kathy. I mean, if I go back to when I was young, which was a while ago, and when I was in graduate school, I was a very rare species in those days. And it's still possible in my life and in Kathy's as well, as scientists, to go into a setting where we are the only woman or one of only a couple, but it's much less frequent than it used to be. What I find now is that, the scientific community, like society, has been changed by the revolution in women's roles. And that's something, that fine institutions like UC Santa Cruz also affected. I mean, we talk a lot about how academic institutions have influenced science and math, but they also influence other aspects. And one of the things that changed a lot in the 60s and after was the role that women were expected or could assume in a lot of professions. And so it takes a little time for it to trickle up, if you will, for there to be enough women to actually have enough around for there to be a selection. And the National Academy of Sciences has done a study on this, the National Science Foundation has, and what you find that certain fields like biology, where the molecular biology revolution created a lot of new fields where there wasn't a history of who should be doing it, there were a lot of women who moved into that field. And there are now quite a number of very prominent women molecular biologists and people who are working in fields related to it. There are still a dearth of women, there is still a dearth of women in physics, in certain areas of mathematics, and we still see many fewer women in engineering than we were expecting. And we've had some interesting anomalies in the engineering fields in particular. When computer science started, it was in some ways, like molecular biology. It was a new field. There wasn't a cultural dominance of male stereotypes or anything of that sort. It was new ideas, and there were a lot of women that went into it, especially when it wasn't in the universities, when a lot of the computer science training was done in businesses that needed to create their own workforce. A lot of women went into the field, and then we've actually seen fewer women going into these fields as the fields have grown up, so to speak. And there's not a really good explanation for it, but some of the work of the National Academy of Sciences has suggested that when it became too nerdy, when the culture that grew up around it was you have to be here 24 hours a day, working day and night, never showering, that sort of stuff, that the women found that was taking up more of their life than they were prepared to commit to a successful profession. They're prepared to commit like anybody else that's a professional, long hours and hard work, but not that level and not that kind of culture that was growing up. So that's changing again. I think more young women are considering these careers because it's so clear that there are some wonderful job opportunities and some wonderful ways to advance one's self and one's intellectual prowess in these fields, and so I think you'll see more women going into it. There will continue to be an issue, I think, in getting young women to see these careers as good choices for themselves and in finding the support systems to get them there. But it's certainly better.
It's much better.
Much better than it used to be.
The point you were making, which has many dimensions, about how do you live your life being a scientist, has a lot of bearing on this. It is, at some level, what every individual is sorting out and doing, male, female, or otherwise, as they work their way into a career. But you do see a lot, some in the research, some anecdotally. Can you see yourself being like that person? Do you see yourself being that narrow or being that rounded? And in styles and paces of competition, as you move through the stages of a career, in whatever field, the intensity it takes, the commitment it takes, how are you as an individual prepared to balance that against the other dimensions of your life, be it family or anything else, and competitive style. There is a predominant competitive style in most of these fields until the number of other people, women or other minorities, gets up to around 10 or 15%. And then the overall culture begins to really more represent that mixture. When you're the first woman in or the first different person in, you have to really find the strength and techniques for yourself that will let you deal with whatever that competitive dynamic is. And I know in the space program in oceanography, historically a very elbows out, sort of mano a mano combative kind of style, which, as I've talked about this retrospectively with a number of my male colleagues, they relished. They loved the fight. They loved the fight of great ideas. It was
challenge of it all.
Yeah, and it was often as not constructively motivated to put your best idea on the table and I'll put mine and we'll fight it out, and that's how we will know the best idea is winning, because we all want to be associated with a cruise that's doing superlative science. And it was an awakening on the order of scales falling from their eyes when they discovered, as women came aboard ship and rose into chief scientist kind of roles, that there are other ways of attaining exactly that level of excellence. And a few of my more candid colleagues and insightful colleagues have acknowledged that before they experienced that themselves and could see the science they were doing was unquestionably the best shipboard science they'd ever done. If you had said, Kathy wants to go to sea but doesn't like to fight quite that viciously, what they would have heard was, settle for less science so that she can come. Mm-hmm. They had never seen that outcome of excellence achieved except by one path. And so that was the path they always turned to with confidence. But there are other paths. And I think a lot of the diversity issues in the sciences have dimensions of this issue, of this problem to them.
And it's certainly easier for a young female scientist today to meet a charming, well-dressed, woman who is raising a family, who's also having a successful scientific career. Not that the world is overrun with such people, you understand, but
they are there.
But they are there.
Yes. And they are running laboratories, and they are commanding spaceships.
I mean, the chancellor of one of our other sister campuses at UC Santa Cruz, UC Riverside, for example, is an astrophysicist. She was the first female to graduate with a PhD, I think maybe the first Hispanic female, she might have been the first female to graduate with a PhD in astrophysics from Caltech. She's got, a young family, youngish family. She does research, she's running a university.
The head of the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute.
Yeah, exactly, and they're also very interesting, quite glamorous women. So I think it's interesting for young women these days to see that, and to realize that, and one of the things I tell a lot of students, male and female, about being in science is don't let the hard work of doing the science, writing the grants, learning the field, don't let that deter you from noticing that most of these folks are traveling all over the world, meeting very exciting people, doing things they love to do, meeting interesting people, some of whom they in fact marry or get involved with. They're having a good time. I mean, if you just take a slice of their life and see what they were like on Tuesday when their grant had trouble, you might not want to have, you might not want to have their life. But then again, 3 months later, when they're on a cruise down the Amazon, doing a biodiversity survey and seeing things that few of us will ever get to see, then it's a different story. So it's...
Yeah, for a fact, I can tell you in my experience, I'm thinking of a certain social engagement where this was exactly the case. I absolutely have never known a fellow scientist, regardless of profession, who doesn't say that they can't imagine they get to have this much fun as their work life. That part of the amazing thing is the things they love to do, the spectrum from just plain fun to supposedly called work, they can't even tell where the line is, as opposed to people who really labor and toil at something for a paycheck so they can go do something they enjoy and pull themselves to the office or to their job reluctantly. I have never encountered that sense of an onerous work life, someone involved in science and engineering.
Oh, I'm sure there are some.
I'm sure there are. But in my experience,
but a more balanced picture is important, I think, for people. And I guess that's one thing that that is hard for teachers in our schools who haven't had experience in science themselves to convey to both young men and young women. And I include, you know, in the sort of new entrance into science, you know, many children and young people from diverse backgrounds, people who've recently emigrated to the country, who haven't had role models in their particular group to move forward. And so it's hard, I think, sometimes for us to get the snazzy stuff out there. It's so easy for young kids to see what it would be like to be a baseball star, what it would be like to be a basketball, maybe what it's like to be very rich and head of a company. They don't quite get what is so sexy and fun about being a scientist, and it's hard for them to imagine it. And that's in today's world where image is everything, and how it's done in the media, and how it's portrayed. If the way in which scientists are portrayed are in some sort of odd way, or they are very isolated from society, or they're nerdy, or all the women are stereotyped as being so focused on science that they have no other interests in life, that's going to drive young people away from thinking about it, while the the head of something is driving his Lamborghini or something like that. It's that's what we're competing against in terms of helping people imagine what life is like.
Also, the experience of what is labeled as science in your school day, for most kids, probably all the way through high school years, for even kids who get onto the science track, at least usually through middle school, it too frequently could not possibly bear less resemblance to what being a scientist is like. It's, Marcy, you used this analogy before, and I'll steal it from you. It's as if you thought you were going to get somebody, excited about the game of baseball or football, pick your favorite sport, by only giving it to them in intense little short doses of just hitting, and then just running, and then just pitching, and then just catching, and hammering on each one of them, and never take them to a ballpark with the game, never see the thrill of it, never
see the
feel the
full
whole
action
thing,
picture.
just be sort of bemoaning how badly pitching went, or they don't get hitting yet. And then you take them to a ballpark, you expect them to find their way to a ballpark and be eager to be a baseball player. They haven't seen baseball. They've seen it fractured into little bits, and in science it's fractured into vocabulary lists and rote mechanical equations and things like that, which is the power of inquiry learning as an alternative way of engaging them in small doses, small variants of being a scientist. Ask the question. Don't look up the answer. Don't memorize the answer. Come here, we got a new question. Let's go build an answer. That helps them get a little bit of that sense of the fun and the challenge of the experience.
Well, let's talk a little bit, too, about the portrayal and the stereotypes of science in the sense of how is it viewed in the eyes of politics and in the media? Are those images helping or hindering it?
Well, there are some very good polling data on this, as a matter of fact, and it shows that scientists are respected at among the highest level with respect to professions. I forget what outranks us, but something, very few things. So we're still seen as credible, we're still seen as worthy of society's encouragement and respect. And so I think that's good news. With respect to the portrayal of scientists, well, when I was the president of the American Academy for the Advancement of Science, AAAS, Michael Crichton was one of our speakers. And he actually gave a very provocative talk because he said, no profession is portrayed well in entertainment. I mean, there's no rule about portraying, nurses in a positive light, or doctors, or lawyers, or business people. It's drama. It is about, keeping people's attention until the next commercial. And so you can't really criticize people for showing scientists, actively engaged in something evil. They've got lawyers engaged in something evil. They've got doctors engaged in something evil. They've got,
business people, Lord knows.
I mean, all sorts of things are happening that, and of course, we see our segment and say, why can't they do better? Now, having said that, I have to tell you that certain television shows have gotten a lot of young people interested in types of science. I mean, there's a tremendous upsurge of interest in forensic medicine and forensic science right now, probably attributable to CSI and some of those types of shows on television, and they have a lot of women in those roles. So, you know, there's an idea.
And able, incredible, and authoritative.
I could do this thing in Miami, or whatever. So I think there's some positive outcomes as well. Now, of course, the way they portray it, a lot of scientists would say, "Oh boy, let me."
It's not necessarily entirely realistic.
Right, but you know, I don't suspect that they probably portray much on dramatic series that's actually real.
Well, and from a point of view of a young person formulating or searching for their nugget of what's going to be their career, you know, frankly, many of those details aren't what matters. They get the glimmer, the hook of, I could do that, that seems so neat. And that will help draw them in. And if they're really sincere and the interest has planted itself deeply enough as they encounter the rather different realities of the actual profession, they'll move through those. But the interest was set.
So, I mean, what I see is that there are, whether they're good or bad portrayals, there are more portrayals of people on the current television shows that are science or science-related. So it's not as buried as it used to be. I mean, it used to be all the sitcoms or all of the dramatic series revolved around people's sexual relations or family relations, and not so much around solving a problem, solving a so I think there's some positiveness to be said about that. So,
and the other thing, I mean, I think more on the cable channels than on perhaps normal network television shows.
There is such a thing as normal network television?
Well, that's a good point. I'm not quite clear what that was.
Topic for another debate.
Topic for another day. Not while these guys are on. But if you look across the whole set of offerings available on television today, there are also things, better biographies, nature, discovery, people going out into animal environments, ocean environments, and this fascinating thread that I see on some of the cable work of mega machines. I mean, really diving in on the challenge of very complex design, whether it has happened already, an aircraft carrier, a space shuttle, a deep sea craft, or
the next big telescope.
Or the next big telescope, or notional ones like a bridge across the Bering Sea. And that ability to take people into those, again, storylines and draw you into what was the real-life drama of figuring out how to design a space shuttle or an oil rig, or what might be the real-life drama of some next great invention, I think is another avenue that certainly we didn't have to get that glimmer. I mean, I got that by watching the actual space flights, but there was not something else on television that sort of took you into a storyline like that and let you sense what that adventure might be like and measure whether that was something that drew you. Okay. So that's very promising.
Good. What about the bigger global picture here about how science is looked at nationally and internationally? Are we focused enough in the United States here on the innovation and the importance of science and moving us forward in the next couple decades? Or do we feel like there could be the possibility that there's so much strong competition in other countries that we may be losing the strength in the science field?
I mean, first of all, science is now international.
Yes.
The concept,
in every field.
The post-World War II idea that a country could sort of lock its scientific knowledge inside and grow its economy and grow its scientific community and keep other people from getting that knowledge is over. I mean, that's over. What we are in right now is an environment where many very talented people in a number of countries are capable of getting an education and creating new knowledge. It is also the case that there is an international movement where people are worried about the outcome of science. So there are sort of two competing things here, or two concurrent things. They may not be competing. One is that science itself has become very international. With the internet and everything, scientists talk to each other across the world on essentially real time. So, Kathy's doing an experiment and she's got a colleague in Russia that she's been collaborating with. They have the data to share in real time. And they can have that conversation, and it is independent of any government concerns. I mean, the government doesn't say, oh, you can't talk. I mean, in some cases, of course, they might. But what I'm saying is that, generally speaking,
there's an extraordinary first-in-history ability to just converse across those boundaries.
And so this means that it is no longer possible for us to have a national policy of putting a sort of capsule around our own intellectual property in our development. So we have to compete internationally for the best ideas. And we have to have the environment in which bright young people want to go on in science, they want to create new ideas, they want to work to develop new businesses, industries, whatever it will be. And they have to recognize that they're not the only ones out there that are capable of doing this. And we do have, I think Kathy said it best, you might want to say something about that, that we're moving away from a nation that's creating a lot of the knowledge to one that's consuming it. And this is not a sustainable process over the long run for us.
Especially, and you can incorporate this in your response, but with the focus so much on technology and consumerism and all the different kinds of skills that we are now being tapped into and encouraged to go towards.
And there is nothing wrong with also being a very clever systems integrator, if you will. That is a kind of creativity and innovation. Take existing capabilities and existing knowledge and imagine and be able to bring to fruition new combinations of them.
Well, the Japanese did that very well in the 90s.
Whether they be new business combinations or new product combinations, that's a very valid segment of technical and product activity. But I do worry, and it's just a personal concern as an American. I think this country, I hope our country will always cherish and nurture and sustain a really rich and vibrant commitment to frontier pursuits and issues. It just is so, so vital. And I do worry about our becoming a little too complacent about, someone else will create it and we'll buy it if we need it. It's a mindset I've seen in school visits going back, more than a decade. We try to fire kids up about space program and you tell them about going to Mars and spaceships, and you'll see them kind of, draped across their desk. And I've actually heard it said after one of these talks, a young girl with a very bored sort of look on her face, who actually said, well, that just all sounds kind of, it seems sort of hard. And do we have to always be the guys who make it? Can't we just buy it? And at some point the answer will become, well, yes, possibly you can, but what do we lose if we become a country that is not a leading innovator nation? Well, everybody can enter the foot race these days. We have no lock on who's on the race oval anymore. The racers can come from anywhere. And if we really want to have that vibrancy of a leading innovative nation, we will only sustain it and retain it the way an Olympic athlete retains their records, by continual striving to be among the best.
Well, I think also it's important to recognize that American companies and our economy is also international. And one of the most disturbing things that I've heard in the last couple of years is when talking with various CEOs of companies in the United States, 5 or 6 years ago, they were moving some of their operations offshore, and the primary driver was a less expensive labor force. They could make their products, their manufacturing could be done less expensively somewhere else. And of course, this is an undesirable thing from the point of view of our economy, but it's understandable from the point of view of a business. What's disturbing now is that some of them are saying, well, we can get an intellectual workforce that's just as good or better, and furthermore, maybe more willing to work on difficult problems off in some of these other countries as well. And so we are giving serious consideration, or already have moved our research and development offshore. That, in the final analysis, will make it very difficult for our young people to have the kinds of jobs and opportunities for the future that we would all like to see them have. So I think that keeping alive, a commitment to innovation, to exploration, to discovery is what I would call it. Kathy's the astronaut. I do biology. So I'm into discovering what life is all about, discovering what medicines can do for you, discovering how we understand ourselves and our bodies. But if we don't have that alive, at least in a certain percentage of our population, we won't be able to capture for our economy the goods, services, and money that we need to be able to provide the kind of society that we all want to live in.
It does really, at an important dimension, come back to jobs. And Marcy, you touched on earlier a variant of this same point. As new technical fields, molecular biology, certain domains of computing opened up, there were new jobs, fundamentally new jobs that hadn't existed before, that were open in a different way to women and other participants. It is innovation that creates whole new segments of new and different jobs, and typically and most consistently creates the most valued and rewarding economically and otherwise to the individual jobs. If we cease being innovators, we will lose that sort of vitality to the job sector for ourselves, for our economy, for our future. You know, it's just imperative.
I'd even throw it back to Allison. I mean, Allison is a professional journalist, and the whole field that has created the opportunities to have these kinds of conversations, but also the interactive international media that we have now, the ability to use certain types of technological advances, digital media, real-time conversations. I mean, look at how it's transformed our understanding not just of science, but of politics in the world.
And the world around us.
I mean, if it happens in Iraq in 5 minutes, we can know it.
In seconds.
That's right. And that's a very, very different world, and a lot of different jobs, and a whole lot of different pressures on those jobs than we had when we had the Pony Express as our main way of getting information in this country.
Let me ask you, and maybe you can combine this as our closing comment here, but two things. Both of you have a lot of science expertise and experience, and also as an astronaut, what could you say, and as a closing comment, that would be something that's inspirational from your own perspective of how we live and survive in our world here? And then also, where do you think science and technology and education is headed in the future?
One glimpse out a spaceship window would quickly supplant any amount of reading and formal study in making it viscerally clear to you that we are a small swarm of inhabitants on an incredibly intricate and gorgeous planet. And it is a planet it behooves us to understand just as well as we understand our economies and our bodies and how we individually live. We are the largest single experiment that's happening on this planet right now, our human beings and the societies that we're creating. And it'll be fascinating, but it will be challenging as we come ahead in the decades to come. But we are all in it together.
Great. Marcy?
Well, I think that the great hope for the future is that there always is something new to discover, and that from as early as we can understand, there have always been people who wanted to know how as well as why, but how. How does something work?
Right.
What can we do about it? And right now, you know, I of course am a happy person because we've been through a very important stage of postmodern scientific development, which focused a lot on the physical sciences, but with our increasing understanding and knowledge of the human genome, we're really beginning to move into an age where we really understand our biology, not just our human biology, but our planet's biology. And I believe the great hope for the future will be getting our young folks now to focus on the future and help us preserve for the generations that are going to come.
Well, thank you both for joining us. We really appreciate your conversation today. We hope that you've also enjoyed our conversation on science and education. Thanks for joining us. I'm Allison Tom. Take care. Goodbye.